Hi, my name is Andre Cohen, and I want to thank you for joining us for this training. In this particular session, we will talk about this idea of implicit bias. We'll talk about how it impacts the brain, how behaviors get formed outside of it. What does context have to do with how we interpret implicit bias? As we engage in this particular training, we'll be presenting a number of new concepts. We'll deal with some things that you might not have heard before, but we encourage you to keep an open mind to think about how these things impact your ability to act with customers, with clients, and with the community. When we talk about these ideas of implicit bias, what we want to do is make sure we have a conversation that is free of fault, blame, and guilt. The context that you've grown up in is not your fault, but it is now your responsibility to do something about it. And so as we have this conversation, I'll be introducing a couple of my colleagues. For example, Rory will be doing our voiceovers, so you'll hear from Rory from time to time. You'll also watch a couple of cartoons that we've made to kind of exemplify the context and the content that we're trying to share. So as you join us in this, we encourage you to be critical in your thinking, take these concepts on, see what fits, and leave what doesn't. And we look forward to seeing how you become actionable in the world. All right, we'll go ahead and start. My name is Andre Cohen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. Outside of the studio, we started to do some introductions to the kinds of ways that we want to work, and we want to continue that inside the studio. I also want to introduce you to a couple of my partners that will also be joining us. One is Heather. She is my robot. I love Heather. She's accurate. Whenever I type in a search, she's able to give me some profound information. So you'll be hearing from Heather. You'll also be hearing some voiceovers from Rory. Rory is our partner in Ireland, and I really appreciate his work. And so you'll hear from him as well as we engage in this process. And lastly, what you will see are also some vignettes. We'll do a cut to some YouTube videos. We'll do some transitions, but I'll let you know where we are in the process so you don't feel lost. We know that the concepts that we're dealing with for many people are new and in some ways controversial, but we want to make sure that we handle this with care and with confidence so that we can communicate in a way that actually engages us to movement. We know that diversity and inclusion conversations can be tricky conversations. People may not necessarily know what to say or what to think, but we want to offer this particular opportunity for you to be a critical thinker. We're not asking you to believe everything that we're offering. We don't expect that you will accept everything at face value. Please do your own research, but consider the concepts that we're offering to you today. And just like we said in our introduction, we're talking about racial implicit bias or implicit racial bias, however you want to say it. It's the same concept. And so as we go through that, there are a few topics, and you'll find those right here, that we'll first start talking about, what implicit bias is. We'll answer that question. We'll talk about the implicit brain. How is it that our minds are organized to deal with implicit bias? We'll talk about what is race, and really try to tease that out, because I think we may be surprised at what it is versus what we think that it is. And we have a couple of cohorts that will spell that out for us. So we'll kick things off to them as well. So also we'll talk about this idea of disparities, because when we talk about race, ultimately we need to have some conversations about the disparities that are caused by race. And then how do we change our own minds? How do we start thinking, acting, and behaving differently, and taking responsibility for our implicit bias? And then lastly, our stories. How is it that we tell our stories, or why is it important that we tell our stories? And I will say this at this point in time, that if you don't know where you come from, it's difficult for other people to have their stories. And so we'll talk and get engaged in that piece of content as well. And lastly, in our closing, it is my hope that we'll get to a place where you'll start to develop and talk about some action plans for yourself as well as for your organization. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I will be referring to some of my notes. So if you see me looking away, that's what's happening. So welcome. This particular training, again, is one that we want to engage you in a conversation about implicit bias, and we'll start to delve into what implicit bias is in just a moment. I do want you to recognize that we all come from a context and we all suffer from the human frailty of that being human, of being vulnerable. And so as you engage in this particular content, I would encourage you to think critically about your own behaviors, and not so much on our delivery or on how flashy things are, but really focus on what it is that you can do ways in which you can think that might make you more actionable in the world. All right, so that's the first thing. So we want to go to this conversation around what is racial implicit bias. And so for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick over to Rory, and Rory will go through some definitions. And once Rory's done with his definitions, we'll come back and tell some anecdotal stories about that definition. So over to you, Rory. All right. I hope that those definitions that Rory gave us can be actionable, that they weren't too esoteric, that they actually were concrete and made sense. And so how do implicit biases act or behave once we have them? And one of the ways I would suggest that oftentimes implicit bias shows itself is through our blind spots. Now,